I'm here today because for 15 years I've been leading an organization called Chazon, Hebrew for vision. We're working within and beyond the Jewish community to create a healthier and a more sustainable world for all. You could argue, of course, that the Jewish people have been thinking about sustainable energy ever since God spoke to Moses out of a bush that was burning but never consumed. Moses might have been the first environmentalist. He recycled a staff into a snake. He got Egypt to turn off all its lights for 3 days. And he convinced an entire nation to go on a 40-year nature hike. I want to make just 3 points deriving from my organization's work and from Jewish experience. The first thing is this. It's not just that we're gathered here today across difference to try to have some influence on climate change and its human consequences. The opposite is also true, that focusing on environmental issues is actually a unique opportunity to build profound and even life-changing relationships, and thus to take on some of the other great challenges of our time, including religious and ethnic conflicts all over the world. I see this in work on sustainable food systems all over the USA. And I see this most strongly at a bike ride that Chazon has produced in Israel every year since 2003. We support an MA program in environmental leadership at the Aravat Institute for Environmental Studies. It's a program that brings together Israeli Jews, Israeli Palestinians, Jordanians, and Americans. They don't go there because they want to work on coexistence. They go there because they're concerned about everything we've talked about here today. They want a professional degree so they can staff NGOs and governments in the region. Truthfully, some of the Israelis don't love the idea of studying with Palestinians and Jordanians, and some of the Palestinians and Jordanians don't even tell their families that they're studying in Israel because that would be so unpopular. But year after year, these students come together specifically because of environmental crises. And year after year, in facing these issues and studying together, they build remarkable relationships. It's not that they agree on everything. They don't. But when they disagree, it's as we might do here today, with respect, with affection, with a deep sense of shared values, plus usually a big plate of hummus. I'd add this is exactly what we saw this morning with Nabil Aboud Ashgar and his beautiful polyphony quartet. And it's what Gaith Al-Tamimi was referring to when he made the connection between human ecosystems and ecological ecosystems in Iraq. So for all of us, let's deliberately use the tackling of climate change to build relationships across difference, especially between groups where there is tension or even strife, every place that we can, every way that we can. If Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians can do it, everyone can. The second thing is about how we face despair. Far too many people are overwhelmed by these issues, and because they feel overwhelmed, they turn away and don't do anything. I think of the old line about the definition of optimism and pessimism. The pessimist says, I just don't see how things could get any worse. And the optimist says, oh, I think I can. Here I offer simply the gifts of Jewish history and Jewish tradition. Right now we're in the period of the Jewish calendar known as the 9 days. Year after year, generation after generation, this has been the time when the Jewish people mourned our losses, starting with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and expulsion from the land of Israel 1900 years ago. It culminates this weekend with a fast day called Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. This was the day of which, when he heard of it, Napoleon in this city said, a nation that cries and fasts for over 1700 years for their land and temple will surely be rewarded with their return. And if there was one man who knew how to dream of a triumphant return from exile, it was Napoleon. What's interesting is that Tisha B'Av in Jewish tradition teaches that the original destruction was the consequence of our own misbehavior. That has profound psychological consequences. It meant that Tisha B'Av was framed by the rabbis not as a reason for passive victimhood, but as a result of our own actions. The resulting sense was that the future was in our own hands, that suffering shouldn't disempower us, but should instead spur us to action. And this leads to my third point, because in Jewish tradition, it's not just about hope, it's about action. In every country in which we found ourselves, the Jewish community strived to create a better world for all. So I want to say a word that in the United States, where I live, seems to be like a swear word. It's not something you ever mention in public company. It's a word all elected officials try to avoid, and religious and environmental leaders don't say much either. We haven't once used this word today, and yet it's critical if we want to do all that we need to do. That word is taxation. Everyone is against taxation, but the word taxation, of course, is not about taxation itself. It's about the things that we want that taxation helps to provide. That's why the Jewish community has had strong systems of taxation going back for 2,000 years. Imagine if in the next 7 years the world's governments invested an extra $1 trillion, with half that money going to improve sustainability and half going to the neediest and most vulnerable people in the world. Wouldn't the world then be a much better place? It sounds impossible, but it's totally doable. That's how we start to move towards zero carbon and zero poverty, as Mary Robinson just put it. By the way, in the last 10 years, many of our governments have introduced pretty serious smoking bans. At the time, they were controversial. 5 years before they were introduced, people didn't believe they were even possible. But there are millions of people today and in years to come who won't get cancer because those laws were passed. Not one of us today would repeal those laws given the chance, and that includes most smokers. Taxing carbon emissions is like taxing cigarettes, except that we all use carbon and we all need to cut down. Thank you very much.